most famous maniac in the world murder. His name was Charles Manson. He was worshipped as God. For Manson's sake his associates were ready to commit unthinkable mutilations, SWA for example with a pregnant woman, and cold-bloodedly looking for new victims. From our videos you know that usually maniacs kill with unfortunate people with the help of cold weapons, rope or bare hands. But Charlie Manson had worse weapons. These are his words. With their help he made girls who were barely 14 years old believe that the world was waiting for the apocalypse, and to survive the end of the world and save their souls they had to do whatever Manson ordered them to do. He used personal insanity carefully and thoughtfully. He spared no one to achieve the creation of a totalitarian cult. Manson wanted his name to become synonymous with the end of the world, and few people realize that the plans of this crazy cult leader were closer than ever to fulfillment. What happens if you cross the cruelty of a maniac and the principles of influence on people? From Dale Carnegie. How the ideals of freedom, peace and justice created a monster that changed the fate of millions. How much truth in the movie Tarantino Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and what does it have to do with the Beatles songs? Friends, this is a series where we talk about the most terrible killers and criminals through the prism of cultural history and politics. My regular co-host Alexander Fabe. Link to his channel in description. Subscribe. Charles Manson is the most manipulative maniac in history, the hero of the 14th serial number. In a small town church in Virginia, a 6-year-old boy was praying. He bowed his head submissively while whispered his favorite Bible passages by heart. All the congregation wondered how Charlie had such a memory. At the same time, in the schoolyard, 2 girls were kicking a classmate in the morning. Charlie made a deal with them. The girls would beat up the bully who was hurting him, and in return he would grant any of their wishes. When the school principal interrogates Charlie, he says it wasn't him, it was them doing what they wanted. This is the same tactic Manson will use 30 years later when the whole of America will be watching his every word. But for now he's 6 and just learning to defend himself, and Charlie had to do it every day. We can guess what the boy Charlie wanted to beat up called him. The thing is that many people thought Charlie's mother was a prostitute and the uncle and aunt he lived with at the time, and even his grandmother, but she wasn't a prostitute. Kathleen XMLPH0000 @deeple.in. As Anson himself said about her just ahead of her time, she liked to dance and socialize at events with different guys, nothing more. But in 1930 it was too bold for a woman. Besides, Charlie's mother was a criminal and not very successful. When the boy was only 4, Charlie's life turned upside down because of $35. His mother, as usual, Lika in the loo, where she met a man who, as she said later, had too much money for one man. She lured the baggage handler to a gas station, and her brother, Luther, held a ketchup bottle to his back. He said it was a gun and ordered the man to pull out everything he had. Eventually the man didn't fall for it. A fight ensued in which Manson's uncle smashed the victim's head in. They stole the man's car. A couple of days later they were caught. Charlie's mother was sent to prison for 5 years, her brother for 10. In the newspapers they were derisively nicknamed ketchup robbers. Charlie was sent to live first with his grandmother and then with his uncle and aunt. Manson's first memory in his life is his mother, who sitting in jail. It was a creepy place, like a medieval castle. Charlie could only see his mom through thick glass, and she was sitting among rapists and murderers who were scared and so frightened. The kid Uncle Charlie showed the pinnacle of upbringing. He made the boy go to jail, though he was always hysterical and screaming in fear at the thought of such a date. It's symptomatic that when Manson was convicted of his famous murder, he would ask to be transferred to a prison in West Virginia, the same one where his mother was serving time. A happy childhood memory. Charlie had only one thing to do when his mom was released. Kathleen took her son. She tried to make a fresh start. She got a job at a grocery store. She got a cheap motel room. She took Charlie to school. The boy was happy. Only he was used to living by his own rules. And school was not part of these plans. Charlie skipped classes and came to his mother at work. Son was so obsessive and unruly that Kathleen could not stand it and tried to dump him in a foster home, so Charlie ended up in a school for boys, Geba, in Stroke, Indiana. According to Manson's mother, visited him from time to time and always promised that they would soon live together again. Eventually he got tired of waiting and ran away from school and went to his mother's house. The next day she sent him back. Manson would later write, "I was embittered and knew real hatred." For a few more years he roamed the correctional facilities and juvenile prisons. For the first few years he was bullied by the caretakers, he was abused in the cells and knocked down by everyone he came across. Charlie was the weakest and smallest boy among of his peers. His physical weakness had to be compensated for. So he learned his favorite manipulation. Manson began to pretend to be insane. If you act like you have demons in you, no one will want to molest you. Now Manson constantly grimaced. In one penal colony, Charlie himself put a glass to the throat of a prisoner and then abused him. Charlie Manson for the first time felt music power. No matter how I've recently started to use neural networks more often studying, I can spend a huge amount of time to collect information, but it is much more convenient to find what you need with the help of artificial intelligence and pay more attention to detailed work. A real boon for me was Yandex browser, in which by default built-in neuro functions for working with text and video, and this is much more convenient than downloading or searching for what you need in a separate application for each resource. In Yandex browser, everything you need right on the main page. I, for example, often use the function of retelling. For this you need to either paste into the browser document or link to the article. The description of N is the opposite of the Ted Bundy we told you about in a separate issue. Check him out if you haven't seen him yet. When Ted was caught, he tried to appear completely normal. He mocked psychologists who tried to find the root cause of the crimes in his childhood. Manson was just the opposite. He made himself look insane by deliberately condensing his early years. Well, it seemed like a lot more than that, but he did it. Charlie said his mom traded him for beer at a bar when he was a baby. But here's one of the stories, which looked like fiction, turned out to be true. It was confirmed by Manson's cousin, the daughter of the aunt and uncle Charlie lived with while his mother was in prison. Charlie's first teacher, on the very first day of school, put him in the last desk. So she made him realize he was so insignificant and uncomplicated that he was not worthy of even sitting next to his classmates, let alone taking part in the lesson. Well, Charlie came home in tears, but did not get support at home. Uncle was horrified not from what the teacher did but from the fact that the boy was crying at all. It's a disgrace for a man. If Charlie wants to make a big fuss, then let him dress like a girl, decided the uncle, and the next day he sent his nephew to school in his daughter's dress. Well, you can imagine what was the reaction of classmates when you are already in general became considered an outcast after that. Besides, a good half of Charlie's family were fanatically religious. Here, yes, in my head too they are fanatically religious, and here they sent him to school in a child's dress. Well, that's how it lives in their head according to their authoritarian grandmother. Smiling too friendly at girls. It's a sin to drink and smoke is forbidden. For swearing with a mat as a direct ticket to hell. As for sex before marriage, Manson's grandmother achieved only one thing: her daughter ran away from her at 15 years old. A year later she gave birth to Charlie, to whom her mother at first not even a name. Turns out such a symbolic. All who went girls with the same fate as his mother, all of them fled from authoritarian families where they oppressed children and did not even try to find a common language with them. Charlie's aunt, unlike his mom, adopted an unbearably strict approach to raising a child. The boy absorbed these same values from religious schools where Manson attended from childhood. For example, in the Gibbs school, even for the most minor violations, children were beaten with either a wooden spatula or a leather belt. Flogging in religious schools in America of those years was generally an absolute norm. However, these schools themselves were actively losing popularity along with the decline in the level of religiosity in America as a whole. This is especially important to talk about in order to understand where the legs of the Charlie Manson cult grow. The trend for religious decline in America began already in the 1880s, and what exactly launched it? Well, it's hard to say. At the same time, everything and everything at once. For example, technological progress and the rise of science. One cannot help but remember that back in 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species by Natural Selection. Darwin's theory shocked many religious people because it generally contradicted everything they believed in, and the number of skeptics, adherents of the scientific approach and scientism after that, on the contrary, only grew. Largely secular education, which became compulsory and undermined the authority of traditional religion. But there were other reasons, of course. One of the leading theories says that the rejection of religion is a consequence of modernization. People began to live in big cities, to work in factories, to distance themselves from their families, from the land, and from traditional communities where religion played a major role in life. People began to travel more between continents. Cultural exchange began. People saw that there were other faiths. Well, let's not forget about the women's rights and labor rights movements. They often spoke out against the conservative charters of the church. There is even a theory that the revolution of consciousness did not happen from the bottom up but on the contrary from the top down. Supposedly it was a deliberate rebellion of educated scientists, teachers and journalists who wanted to subjugate the public institutions of the Enlightenment. For example, in 1933, a year before Manson was born in America, they published a humanist manifesto. The main idea was that people can build a just society without believing in the supernatural, but the effect of the document was certainly not like from 95. Martin Luther's theses, where he generally criticized the Catholic Church, but still people gradually abandoned the religious format in favor of personal, more flexible, as it seemed to them, forms of spirituality. In the matter of the decline in religiosity, the states are little. How are they different from other Western countries? Well, except for the effect of a high base of believers in America, there are still very many. According to the Lopa Institute today, 41 Americans go to church every month and every fifth American every week, that is, 52 times a year. However, in the middle of the 20th century, the church could no longer respond to all the demands of society. People began to look for other ways how to unburden one's soul. The methods were quite banal. In where Charlie grew up there were 5 grocery stores for churches, and as many as 32 bars, and this is for more than 1,000 people. In California, where the main part of our history will take place in the 50s, became the center of religious pluralism and experiments. This state has always been ahead of national trends. Well, take the same Kremlin Valley, the same thing with spirituality. Unlike the more conservative states, their people first. Nima new hobbies directed to our years. More people began to immerse themselves in Eastern spirituality, to learn the principles of ruiz and in general to join movements that no one had heard of before. Religion went beyond the church. People became richer, but they did not stop spiritual searches. Self-proclaimed gurus began to appear all over the country, and people began to kukava spiritual teachers in real time, created countercultures positioned in contrast to age-old postulates. And here one of such gurus will be Charles Manson. He will take all the popular ideas of spirituality, then chop up a vinaigrette from them to control not only their desires but also people in general. Familiar? Yes. Picture? Yes. If we look at the modern environment for us with all these gurus from Instagram, there is also spirituality and spiritual practices in general. They are like a supermarket on one table. Jesus Christ, Buddha. Some ancient Aramaic cult here means a little from the world of Shambhala. Here you have some ancient beliefs of the Incas, and that's it, and a new one sits some spiritual guru and says that, well, God is one, as if I communicate with different. Here are representatives of cults and different, therefore, gods, and I will teach you this now. That is, as we can see today in the 21st century, this is generally as popular in Russia as in the 60s it was popular in America. Music. It is believed that Manson is the only maniac in history who did not kill anyone with his own hands. This is not the whole truth. He wanted to kill but did not kill. In the bloody summer of 60 years, Charlie had a quarrel with the dealer, and during the quarrel he was shot. The poor guy was lucky and he survived, only Charlie did not know about it. He left the dealer to decompose in his own apartment with a calm soul left for Naren. Now I want to draw your attention to this moment. Charles Manson was not afraid to kill in the same way he was not afraid of prison or death. This happens if you are 32 years old but you have spent half your life behind bars. The usual habitat for Manson is a cell in the prison yard. Life outside of prison turned out to be hell for him. What was he in prison for? Let's go through all the crimes in order. At the age of 14, from the boarding school, in order to have something to eat, he robbed grocery stores. The court sent him to a religious orphanage for difficult teenagers. There is even a photo of this wonderful moment, how the problem boy got on the path to correction, though the re-education lasted only 4 days. Then Charlie with his classmates stole a priest's car and went to Illinois. On the way the guys robbed a couple more stores. The uncle of a classmate was a professional thief. When mom arrived he took them as students to study this craft. Manson was clearly more interesting than cramming the multiplication table, though even in this area Manson was a bad student. The guy was arrested after 2 weeks. During one of these raids he was sent to a correctional school in Indiana. Manson tried to escape, and not once or twice but 17 times. It worked only on the 18th try. At that time Charlie was already 16. As he recalled, by the ST years I lost all fear of everything that the prison system administration had to offer. Manson continued to rob gas stations and then tried to escape to California in a stolen car of his. Caught at the state line, Charlie was sent to a national school for boys where he was found to be aggressively antisocial. Then he was transferred to a labor camp. He could still be released, but before the hearing Manson was caught for abuse. Then the guy was transferred to the federal colony for a certificate. There he committed 8 more serious disciplinary offenses for which he was sent to a maximum security colony in Ohio. And then a miracle happened. Charlie suddenly became obedient, attentive, smiling, aggressive. The scum of society, rapist and robber, suddenly became a kind and sociable guy. In May, P.T. Manson was released early. He returned to his hometown. There Manson continued to play the role of a law-abiding citizen, and it turned out well. A local waitress, Rosie, even fell in love with him. There are photos from their wedding on them. Charlie looks like the most charming groom of the mining town. Only later, when they ask him about Rosie, he will say that he just wanted sex, and in those times and in those places you could only get it after marriage. Rosie quickly got pregnant. Manson realized that he could not provide for his family with the salary of an assistant at a local store. Then he went back to stealing cars, but that didn't work either. Stealing cars and stealing only who was there to sell them to the city was tiny. Then Charlie suggested that Rose move to California. He put his pregnant wife in a stolen car, and again he crossed the state line. The operation was successful. Lay low, but no, instead of abandoning the car on the side of the road, Charlie drove it around the city, studied all the hot spots. Psychologists will say later he subconsciously wanted to be caught so that he could go back to prison. We will not go into this step. Let's talk about the facts. Manson again ended up behind bars, and it was clearly easier for him to live there than on the outside. It turned out that Charles grew up together with the American criminal system before criminals just outside the world for some time, and then threw them out into society where there was no place for them. This approach had a negative impact on the health of society. Prisons, instead of re-educating people, were raising professional criminals. We can see it well judging by the number of recidivism of Manson alone. Then the philosophy of American prisons began to change. Now punishment had to have a purpose. During the time people spent in prison in isolation, they had to learn skills that could be useful to them in the normal world. After serving time for stealing a car, Manson would be prosecuted twice more. The first time for trying to cash a counterfeit check, but he was saved from prison by tearful statements. Leona Ray Stevens. She gave a speech in court about her great love for her fiancé with Rosie. By that time he had already divorced. Somehow in court SLM believed Charlie was put on probation. Manson, without thinking twice, took Leon, another lady, to engage in prostitution in New Mexico. In the end, the 3 of them were caught for this when they crossed the state line. The charges were eventually dropped, but for violation of probation he was sentenced to 10 years. Charlie was happy in prison on McNeil Island in Washington state. Manson and learned all the necessary skills for life. Firstly, he learned how to win friends and the lifestyle of an ordinary person. It's not just about family, work and body, but also about consciousness. In this, hippies were able to help with various prohibited substances that the state declared illegal at about the same time as the representatives of this subculture became addicted to them en masse and began to lose their health. The hippie fashion reached its peak when America became most intensively involved in the Vietnam War. But here it is worth emphasizing that despite their attitude to those events, hippies were not, in the classical sense, politicizing their ideas through their lifestyle, but elections and 2230, influencing people. Dale Carnegie taught him this, not personally. Well, through a course on his manuals that prisoners took in prison. The goal of the course was good: to teach marginals to communicate with people. Carnegie proposed a set of rhetorical and non-verbal manipulations to subjugate people. Manson was delighted with these ideas. We will see how he successfully applies Carnegie's advice. Secondly, in prison, Charlie studied the new teachings of Scientology. The cornerstone of this pseudo-religious studied in prison. This is to play the guitar. The tutor became the leader of the gang, Alvin Carpy. This character describes such a fact. At that time in the history of the United States there were only 4 people who received the title of public enemy number 1. Carpy was the only one who was taken alive. When Manson's term ended he refused to go free. He reported to the authorities that the prison had become his home and asked him to leave him there, and in high offices they did not fulfill his request, and then they bitterly regretted it. When Manson was released in 67th year he decided to return to the old Good pimping only he did not know that while he was gone for the first time in thousands of years the demand for prostitutes collapsed, sexual freedom reigned and the search for forbidden fruits became less in demand. There were many reasons for this, but the main two are feminism and birth control pills. About the magic the saw we talked about in the issue of the sample. In short, I will remind you that in the 60th a new method of contraception was legalized, simple, reliable and quite effective. Women rushed to doctors for prescriptions for these pills. Pills turned women's worldview upside down. Contraceptive changed the economy, changed demography, yes, and basically changed the place of women in the world. But the main thing in our history is different. The sexual revolution began. Sex became a justified need for a woman which she can easily realize. Bra and men no longer had to pay for casual meetings, and without plans for a serious relationship it became possible to find a girl with similar goals to recognize such. Women on the street were not difficult. They dressed unusually, wore outlandish hairstyles, lay all day on the grass in the park, listened to songs with a guitar. Everyone knew that hippies, which many of the girls considered themselves, were the most crazed people in America. This movement was set by outstanding musicians of the 60s: Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, the Jefferson ERP group. Charlie Manson simply dreamed of being in this row of musical stars, but more on that later. Where did hippies come from? They came from the beatniks. They were young people in the 40s and 50s who didn't care about the American dream and didn't care about politics. Their leaders were such characters as writers Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac. They despised everything bourgeois, especially if it concerned the capitalist corporate system. They didn't want a new house, a car, a stable job. They thought we wouldn't have a second life, so it's better to laze around, be creative, be spiritually free, and listen to fashionable music. Well, for example, jazz. Hippies, unlike beatniks, appeared later. Already in the 60s they loved music more than books. Besides, they put at the forefront not philosophy but love, peace and harmony with nature, and they were also an irreconcilable pacifist. The very word hippie was first heard on a New York TV channel. This name was used on air to describe a long-haired man in t-shirts who protested against the Vietnam War. Well, mostly hippie students. They had the same view on career and consumer culture as you beatniks, only instead of jazz they started listening to rock music. Hippie simultaneously protested against religion, puritanical morality, war, and against politics. They had a very characteristic slogan: turn on, tune in, fall out, that is, refuse the lifestyle of an ordinary person. It's not just about family, work and body, but also about consciousness. In this the hippies were able to help various prohibited substances that the state declared illegal at about the same time when the representatives of this subculture got hooked on them en masse and began to lose their health. The hippie fashion reached its peak when America became most intensively involved in the Vietnam War. But here it is worth emphasizing, despite their attitude to those events, hippies were not, in the classical sense, politicizing their ideas through their lifestyle, but elections and political parties were completely uninteresting to them then. They were also not interested in a revolution like Lenin's or Trotsky's. Revolution was important to them, consciousness. They expressed their ideas through symbols of art and through spiritual practices, and from this point we understand why musicians became the leaders of the hippies. Well, music is an ideal and simple way to convey an idea, your philosophy and meanings, and without the help of a translator. When Jimi Hendrix first smashed his guitar on stage, everyone understood that this was a symbol of the fight against something habitual that can cause rejection. Manson was released from prison in the spring of 67th year, and after a couple of months the famous Summer of Love happened and took part in NM actively. He got in among hippies. Vs about the World Cup. He was loved well because there everyone loved each other, listened to his music, because hippies, like moths to a light bulb, flock to any person with a guitar. And the main thing, hippies are a buffet of vulnerable people, from easily suggestible teenagers who seem to be just waiting to be taken under their wing. Some mature guru Charlie, who was 33 years old, began to gather girls around him who moan a group of his companions. His listener entrance went all the principles of persuasion and all the principles of influence like Carnegie. And not only Manson very quickly realized that he could not withstand competition with other guru among hippies. Everything was common, but Charlie did not want to share his girls with anyone. Then he gathered everyone he could reach and went with them to early Hollywood so he jealous intermediate could isolate girls from the rest of society. And this is one of the key principles of any totalitarian music. Sect. In the first half of the 60s, the Beach Boys were the most popular band in America. Striped shirt songs about surfing and bikinis became a symbol of the States, and so it was until the four from Liverpool were brought into the country the Beach Boys could not compete. At the end of the Sheck, one of the members of the Bra got hooked on drugs and could no longer perform. His brother drummer Dennis went on an indefinite binge in his house in Hollywood. By the way, he survived the recent fires. Somehow Dennis was driving home from the studio. After recording a new song, he realized that it was a rather pathetic attempt to return former glory. The guy then dreamed of only one: put something strong to a glass prim in the company of pretty girls, and then the headlights illuminated two thin figures. Cute girls asked to give them a ride to the ranch, but word for word Dennis persuaded hitchhiker to go to his house in the morning before going back to the studio. He, with a strong hangover, told them, "You can stay as long as you want, make yourself at home and whatever you think." In the evening, a whole crowd of hippies was waiting for him in the living room. They danced, sang, hugged. Car community called all these people their family, and they also introduced Dennis to the one whom they considered their father brother and who was their lover. With Charlie Manson immediately threw himself at Dennis's feet, began to thank him for his creativity and contribution to music. The drummer melted as if by magic. The girls began to undress, and under Dennis's tongue there was something forbidden. Musician. In the end, he allowed the Manson family to stay with him for a couple of days, but the days turned into weeks. The musician was forced to move to the guest room house while Charlie's Angels were having fun in his huge house, drinking alcohol, smoking, and eating his food. Where does such generosity come from? It's simple. Dennis believed that this is how he saved his soul. Look, as soon as Manson ended up in the musician's house, he immediately began to preach. Charlie was a born manipulator and charismatic. People easily fell for all his differences. According to one of Charlie's covenants, everyone who embarked on the true path had to give up their ego. Namely, the ego, like the parrot Iago on the musician's shoulder, found that you need to fight for happiness, but the enlightened know joy bring only suffering because it is fleeting. 'Cause addiction, the ego tells you, Dennis, that you are a loser because no one needs your group anymore. John, Paul, George and Ringo are a completely different matter. In fact, a successful career would never bring you happiness. You can achieve true harmony if you give up all your desires and start living one day at a time in that house. Come on your nose. Manson preached to Dennis's friends in Hollywood. Canadian musician Neil Young said that he was impressed by Manson and his music. He even compared this guru to Bob Dylan. Manson was thrilled by such attention because he himself did not give up his ego for a second. In Dennis's house while he was serving even became knuckle. Manson already had more than 100 songs, and he agreed with Brian, Dennis's brother, that he would record some of them in his home studio. But everything went badly. Manson took with him girls who could neither sing nor play instruments, and altogether they behaved like some kind of fools. Brian tried to open Dennis's eyes, but he did not care how generous Dennis was to Charlie, and Manson did not spare anything for his new student. For example, he gave him one of his songs and the Bach Boys really sang it. The song is called Never Learn Not to Love. You can find it on YouTube. People from Goli and calls the composition Cult Killer good. Well, and in general a great song for the whole family, though it was precisely because of this song that the relationship between Dennis and Manson deteriorated. The musician did not include Charlie as a co-author. Manson, in response, handed Dennis a bullet wrapped in a handkerchief and added that he had many of those on the same day. Dennis Wilson, who later entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the drummer and lead singer of the Beach Boys, moved out of their homes forever. So Manson realized that it was time for him and his family to leave. The last attempt to become a rock star happened on a ranch. To audition Manson, an important producer came to audition who made the group the Byrds famous and put his soul into the performance. But every time I looked at the sword I saw the bored face of a man who was dragged out so far in vain. As a farewell, LR gave Charlie money and said he would call back, but no one would call anyone. Of course, was going to the rage that covered the failed star after the refusal drove Manson crazy. Charlie even went to the producer's house himself, but a beautiful blonde opened the door. She smiled at Charlie and said that Terry MLR no longer lived there. This blonde's name was Sharon Tate. That's how Manson's musical career ended, but not his ambitions. Manson's teaching in terms of content was a real mess of religious borrowings and personal experience of the sect leader himself. He took some things from the Bible, well, take out of context only those fragments that in generally met his goals. Charlie pressed passages about the submission of women to their husbands. Manson instilled in the girls from the sect that their role was to serve men well, and most importantly Charlie himself. He was able to gain complete power over dozens of people who were at his disposal. Manson could undress them at any moment, go to bed with them. He controlled them like a puppeteer. Well, from a completely crazy girls could not start eating until we'll start eating them. Guru, any desires, ambitions, thoughts, girls at all cost, nothing. And in case of Charlie, all I liked such a system according to him. Women are beautiful if they do what they should and keep their mouths shut. The second point that Manson liked in the New Testament is the revelation of John the Evangelist, that same part about the end of the world. The truth is in Manson's head everything was mixed up, and because of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse he accepted 4 members of the Beatles. I'm not kidding now. Charlie, like everyone in the 60s, was obsessed with the Beatles. His agitated mind brought his love for the group to a new level. He believed that the Beatles communicated with him through songs and wrote many of their songs only for so that Charlie Manson could hear them. Need, for example, the ballad I Will. The Beatles allegedly asked Charlie to record an album in which it would be sung that MSN is the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and in the song Helter Skelter Lennon warned the leader of the sect of racial war that blacks will start against whites. But it certainly sounds like the ravings of a madman. But this was only the beginning. Preparation, music. God is preparing to lower the curtain on this game and start it anew with his chosen people. Well, by chosen people is meant naturally the family. Manson, and who is at the head of the family? Charlie himself. He never spoke about it directly but many times hinted, for example through in a phrase like this: for 2,000 years for your sins I have been suffering. To win girls in an altered state considered it a real miracle in general. In the eyes of the sectarians, Manson became the Messiah, and the Messiah can save only the pure or the chosen. And how to understand that you are the chosen one? Yes, it's very simple. You are the chosen one if you are faithful to the teachings of the cult leader and follow his instructions. All elements of Manson's philosophy had the goal of manipulating, intimidating, and depersonalizing. All so that a person literally lost himself and became dependent only on the cult leader. Girls were carefully limited from the rest of society. Charlie did all so that the real world became unnecessary to them. Well, why, if the community has everything: food, housing, drink, love, and acceptance? Cito answered all the questions of the students. This in the cruel reality: everything is complicated and everything is unpredictable, and in our family Manson life is very simple, including this is why sects flourish precisely in the small moments of human history. For Russia it was the 90s, and for America the end 60s. Well, look at the conflict in Vietnam, the Cold War. Endless protests killed one Kennedy, the second killed Martin Luther King. People did not know what to cling to, where to find support in the era of cataclysm. Someone was helped by family, partner, friends. In the end the church, which still remained influential, and for lonely people with a difficult fate where to go was much more difficult for them, and it was they who fell into the tenacious clutches of religious fanatics. Another mandatory attribute of a successful cult is a dulling of consciousness. This contributes to hard work, lack of sleep, and malnutrition. In the case of Manson, critical thinking was suppressed with the help of illegal substances and orgies. In the cult Children of God, which arose around the same time as the Manson family, there was a practice called limiting silence. We know about it from the words of a girl who, when she was 10 years old, the cult forbade her to talk to anyone for 11 months. You can imagine, and it seemed that she was going crazy and losing touch with reality. This the leader of the cult achieved, and the final touch of any destructive community: complete isolation from the outside world. Manson forced girls to call their parents so that they would say they don't need to claim photographs from a past life, and burned it all. He even forbade wearing glasses. They say without them they saw the world in a more natural way. True, because of this many cultists ruined their eyesight even more. Of course, Charlie had a monopoly on information. Only he himself could remember the past. It reached the point of absurdity. Manson did not give the girls even sitting with too thoughtful look, because any internal dialogue that the cult leader doesn't know about was considered a threat. Doctors naturally weren't allowed to the girls either. At the same time, everyone was encouraged to have children. When pregnant women from the family started giving birth, everyone was already ready. Manson enjoyed the special right to personally gnaw music. From American films we know that hippies often lived in mobile homes. 7 girls were like that too. The sectarian, together with Charlie, stole a school bus and remade it for themselves, removed the seat, arranged sleeping places and shelves for storage, repainted the bus from yellow to black. But Manson was too successful A preacher. He took girls to the sect straight from gas stations. One of them would later tell that she was driving with a guy on some business of her own. They stopped at the ZS to go to the toilet and quickly charmed her with his cheeks and kind smile. It was worth him to throw just a couple of phrases and the girl melted. One of these phrases were the following: "Let me guess, father doesn't really love you and no one takes you seriously." After a couple of minutes she was taking things from the car and throwing them into a black school bus. Soon it could no longer accommodate everyone who wanted to follow Nam on empty dachas. Hollywood acres. You will linger. Needed to settle somewhere not far from Los Angeles in the Californian mountains. Lived out the last years already. No longer needed film set for westerns. It stood on the ranch of George Spanakopita. She made sure that Span was always high and received as much affection as was needed. Weaker 80-year-old man in the film Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Tarantino clearly showed how carefully hippies protected their Spanakopita and confirmation of loyalty for those who already. In the case, for example, each of the sectarians had to get food. Girls searched garbage cans near stores and took more or less edible products. Freeganism is a classic hippie movement, and what better way to show that the consumer society throws away too many useful resources if not to eat what is thrown away by those very stores. In addition to teenage girls and pretty, he delegated to them the most important task of luring new girls into the sect. Manson learned through experience that they are easily influenced. Nice and friendly men. We are not talking about all the girls, of course, but specifically about those who fit the type. Let's draw a portrait of a typical girl from a Tsenev family. Age is very young. Many were 14, 15. The family is dysfunctional, not necessarily poor but rather religious. Excessive religiosity and conservatism. Parents were often provoked by the most vivid teenage rebellion. Post-war trauma of fathers resulted in alcoholism, which often ended in domestic violence. Both led to the fact that the children ran away from home. Girls usually were unsure of themselves. They considered themselves unattractive, stupid, worthless. Manson, on the contrary, overwhelmed them with compliments. They would later remember how next to Charlie they first felt beautiful and loved. Charlie got them hooked on the needle of a good relationship, and the girls were ready for anything only to continue to like Charles. Patricia Kren Incal, who will then kill for Manson, will say, "I just wanted to feel safe, to feel that someone cares about me. I have never experienced this from anyone in my life." She is still in prison, by the way. She is 77 and she almost got out on parole 3 years ago. Life in Charlie's commune at first was not much different from the situation in any other peaceful community. He Perry, everyone gave each other love, sang songs, danced and lived for the day. Everything changed when Manson realized that he would not build a career as a musician. He suddenly became angry at the whole world, and life in the family was no longer the same. Charlie began to beat for sidelong glances for the net words. The place of daring was taken by violence and abuse. After one such incident, one of the girls then sat in a stream, watched the water turn red and thought how to stop her suffering. And the rapist Manson did not regret anything. On the same day he tried to kill the dealer we are talking about, they said at the beginning of the video, but he, as we remember, miraculously survived the next day after the attack and saw on the news that one of the leaders of the Black Panthers had died. We talked about them in the episode about the Zodiac. It was a dangerous gang that took revenge on the police for their cruelty towards blacks. Charlie thought that he had unknowingly killed a gang member. And that meant only one thing: they would come for him soon. The Manson family began to prepare for the attack. They established contact with a gang of thug bikers. They began to supply the family with weapons in exchange for an. He taught the girls how to deliver fatal blows with a knife and shoot a pistol. The Spano Ranch began to look like a combat academy. But the Black Panthers still did not come. Then Manson decided to take matters into his own hands. Charlie realized that it was time for him to start a race war. Then the Black Panthers would simply not have the strength to take revenge on the MCO. In his opinion, the end of the world simply needed a kick in the ass. The Manson cult began. In general, it was harmless. Charlie sent the cultists to random houses in Los Angeles, and always late at night. There they rearranged the furniture while the residents were sleeping, and now imagine you wake up in the morning, everyone seems to be alive and well, but the whole house is upside down, so you can go crazy with fear and paranoia. This was Manson's idea, but the peaceful pranks did not last long. Soon the cult began to kill. For the first time, it was by accident. Of his friend, a poor music teacher, to sell drugs to bikers. They overdid it with the dose. They decided that they They brought some crap. Bosolio personally came to the musician and started shaking him. He said that he didn't have any money. A fight broke out. They poked Bobby, called me and asked what they should do now. Charlie arrived at the scene spectacularly with a meme and cut the co in horror sleep. And why did he do that? He answered, to show you how to be a man. Charlie left. Bobby tried to heal the wound himself, but the teacher begged to be taken to the hospital. Bailey realized that he would have to choose the life of a friend or the fate of the whole family. In the hospital, Harry could easily turn in Manson and everyone. The rest of them burned in Bruce via drew a panther's paw next to him, the sign of the Black Panthers. Naturally, this was done in blood. This was supposed to send the police on a false trail, but Bobby was eventually caught and imprisoned and is still sitting. The murder of the music teacher brought the Manson cult to a new level of violence. All this time in the Manson family, preparations for the end of the world were in full swing. According to Charlie's plan, they needed to hide somewhere and wait for the blacks to defeat the whites and then come out of hiding and help the blacks rule the world because they themselves can't handle it. The plan is brilliant from all sides. There is an unconditional faith in the victory of blacks and ossified racism. Manson was generally sown from paradox as well. Who was embarrassed by this? Then later he will admit you can convince anyone of anything if you constantly impose it on him, especially if he has no other information on the basis of which he could form his opinion. Charlie considered the so-called Death Valley the ideal place to wait out a race war. Well, now it's impressive. A national natural park between Nevada and California. The valley has a characteristic name. Well, it's essentially a huge desert there. The sectarians began to bring stolen cars to rebuild them into buggies. On a buggy it is more convenient to move around the desert. At the same time they were looking for a cave. Manson heard somewhere the legend that in the Valley of Death there is allegedly a huge underground cave in which there was everything for survival: fresh water, juicy fruits and animals from fairy tales. Their Manson's sect planned to settle. The girls' brains were washed from them. They believed in the cave they will grow wings and they will turn into elves. In those years many Americans really believed that the end of the world was near. In society for many years hysteria and a culture of fear reigned. The fact is that the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union was in full swing. Everyone was looking for spies in their country. In the case of the USA there was a hunt for insidious communists. In the lessons in American schools they showed films where the Turtlebird taught children how to hide from a nuclear explosion. Well, in the month of the Cuban Missile Crisis a few years before the appearance of the Manson sect, the level of madness simply went beyond any limits, and people in principle could be understood. There is such a film, Blast from the Past with Fraser. According to the plot, a man and a pregnant woman lock themselves in a bomb shelter and sit there for almost 40 years because they believe that America was hit by an atomic bomb. But such a story could have happened in reality. In the 50s and 60s, shelters were built in private homes and universities, in hospitals, and police stations. According to various estimates, by the mid-60s, up to 200,000 could have been built in the U.S. Think about it. Private shelters. School held regular training alerts in which children were taught to hide under desks. People lived in daily fear, and of course nerves could not stand the idea of hiding for a couple of decades underground. Did not sound so crazy at all, and at that moment the most incredible fantasy of mankind came true. People conquered space. How one flight changed the whole world. We talked about in the episode about Yuri Gagarin. Watch it, and everything would be fine, but it gave rise to even more panic in the conditions of Ho when Americans got used to the fear of Soviet threat. Aliens became a symbol of another, now incomprehensible and mysterious enemy. Well, watch the episode on our second channel on the Reading channel about Area 51. People still believe that there are aliens there, so the remains are preserved. The leader of the Heavenly Gate sect used people's fear of danger from space. He taught his students human bodies are the so-called containers for the soul and that they must leave the earth to become part of a higher civilization. Alien civilization. All this crazy sectarianism ended in the death of 39 man. The threat of nuclear war, the conquest of space, the famous incident near the city of Rose with a UFO. Well, that's enough for one decade of adventures, but that's not all. We shouldn't forget about the social revolution. Feminists fought for the legalization of abortion and the abolition of the Miss America competition. Blacks opposed segregation and discrimination. Students opposed the war in Vietnam, and all of them with varying degrees of bias. Mutazella police. This caused new riots. Now there was complete chaos in society against state violence. And Charles Manson skillfully took advantage of it. Why Manson directed his sect specifically to Polanski's house? There are several theories. The first is that he supposedly thought that producer Terry L.R. lived in this house, but we already said that Manson came to this house and knew that the producer was no longer there. The only scene in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in which appears Charlie shows this very first and last meeting of Manson and Sharon Tate. The second theory says that the family wanted to protect Bobby Basile, the same one who killed the music teacher, because the hippies also left on the walls of the Tate house bloody like Bobby. The police must have thought that the real killer was still at large. The third theory is already the official version of the accusation. Manson wanted to cause riots that would launch a full-scale race war. The inscriptions should have led the police to the Black Panthers. They would have started to defend themselves further like a snowball. The end of the world would have begun in Polanski's house. Manson chose Polanski's house by chance just because he knew such an address and knew that there were people there. On the evening of August 8, Manson gathered several members of the cult and ordered they go to this house on Sela Drive. He chose the most loyal students, Susan, Patricia, Linda, Kasabian and Tex. He ordered them to go to the house, completely destroy everyone who was in it, and do it as cruelly as possible. Sharon Tate and 3 of her close friends were relaxing in the house that evening. Famous Hollywood hairdresser J. Sebn, heiress of Some and screenwriter of WOH Freaks NTE, was 1 month old and was about to give birth. Friends lived with her for support if labor suddenly began. When the sectarians drove up to the house, Yusin climbed a pole and cut the telephone line to the house. Suddenly the gate opened and the dachshund lit up the headlights of the car. Yusin wiped Ista out and NT was visiting his friend. He lived in the Polanski guest house. NT Tex carefully honked in response. He took out a knife. NT was confused and covered his face with his hands. The first blow fell on the wrist itself. The watch strap was cut off as if with a razor. Then Tex shot the guy 4 times. Watson told Linda to go around the back of the house. The others went from the front. Tex opened the window, climbed inside and opened it for the girls. The door. He told Son and Patry to go see who was in the back of the house. At that moment Abigail was reading in bed, just waved at the killers when they passed by. The girl thought they were visiting. Frikovsky was sleeping on the couch in the living room. He woke up from the rustling and Watson kicked him in the head. When the screenwriter asked Tex who he was, what he was doing, Watson replied that he was the devil and doing the devil's work. The girls dragged all the victims into the living room. Say Bring begged to let at least the pregnant woman go. Watson beat him up for this with the handle of a revolver, then shot and stabbed 7 times. A bloodbath began. Abigail ran out into the backyard. The cultist chased her across the lawn. Patricia knocked her to the ground and stabbed 28 times. Frikovsky tried to run out of the house but fell. Tex hit him 13 times with the handle of the gun, fired and then stabbed 51 times. At this time held the knife to the throat of still alive Sharon Tate. The actress spent the last minutes of her life under the roar of gunshots and the screams of her friends, to which Atkins replied to her, "Listen, accept it already, you will die." Susan later admits that she did not feel anything at all, neither anger nor hatred. All her actions, as she said, carried only love. Perhaps this is a reference to the words of the leader of the Manson cult. He often said that the highest manifestation of love is to kill for the sake of her beloved. After short negotiations, Atkins stabbed Sharon Tate with a knife. Tex came to her aid. Together they stabbed her 16 times. Sharon's last word was "Mom." When everyone was dead, Watson threw a rope over the crossbar and tied one end to Sebn's neck and the other to her neck. Tate Atkins took towel, dipped it in blood and wrote the word "pig" on the door. They called the police. After that the killers threw off their dirty clothes and guns, changed clothes and calmly got to their home. Few people know, but the crime of the Manson cult did not end there. When the mad fanatic found out how Tate's murder went, he was disappointed. There was too much panic and attempts to escape. The next day he put his comrades in the car and said that now he would show how it's done. They stopped at the house of the head of the supermarket, Lena Labey, and his wife. Rosemary's house was next to the place where Manson and his family once stopped for a party. The front door of Lanka was not locked then. People trusted their neighbors and were not afraid of either thieves or especially murderers. That Manson just walked in, threw the spouses on the floor and tied their hands with a leather belt so that they would not scream. He added that it was just a robbery, no one would harm them. Manson left the house and invited members. Sects deal with this. 7 Charlie stop. Added, make sure that each of you will be involved in the murders. Watson with the girls entered the house from the kitchen, brought 2 knives. Patricia threw the victim on the bed and began to stab her but hit the collarbone and the blade of the knife bent. Then Usain came to the rescue. 3 sectarians inflicted 41 wounds on Rosemary. Lulu then complained that it was very hard and she was very tired of killing her. Lanka stuck a fork into the head of the family and then 12 more times she stabbed him with a knife on his stomach. She carved the word war. After that the maniacs took a shower and another sectarian opened the refrigerator, drank chocolate milk. Her other associates ate cheese and before leaving they wrote on the refrigerator Helter Skelter, the name of that very Beatles song. You may remember the series of films Police Academy. Well, the humor there is based on the fact that people who in theory should protect the law themselves constantly sow chaos. They are stupid and careless. So the most terrible deaths in the history of Hollywood were investigated by police officers who the best place was not at the police station and in the role of the heroes of an absurd comedy. When the police arrived at the scene of the murder they were, to put it mildly, stunned. But not every day you see 5 corpses with dozens of living people in one place. From shock they forgot that perhaps you shouldn't step on the tracks of maniacs and spread the blood of Polanski's wife on the soles of your shoes. Maybe you shouldn't touch things in the house where a murder had just taken place without gloves. The policeman who opened the gate with a button, which successfully erased the criminal's fingerprint, then explained, well, I had to get in somehow. Then the logic is ironclad. You can't argue. What can we say about properly detaching the crime scene? The police didn't do it right away, so the reporters helped Manson cover up a couple more clues. The first suspects were actually made from the guy from the guest house. It was that student who came to see him. It was suspicious that the guy didn't notice anything at all, but then it became clear that he might not have heard the shots and might not have heard the screams from his room in general. When the guy was released, the police were left empty-handed, but the murder was committed by absolute novices from their experience. Well, a couple of slashed chairs and shooting at sparrows, and in the end they got out of the water dry, leaving the police in fools. But they were murderers. They couldn't help but stain all their clothes in liters of spilled blood. One of the journalists guessed about this. The journalist is not a cop. He arranged an experiment, took several of his colleagues. They got into a car near Tate's house and drove in the same direction where the killers could have gone. On the road they immediately started changing clothes. It took about 6 minutes. They finished on the bridge. The journalists slowed down, got out of the car, and Polly jeans were lying underneath. Naturally all covered in blood, and there was no gun there. It was accidentally found by a boy who was playing near the house. Ironically, 1 hour 2 minutes and 34 seconds. That he behaved professionally. All the policemen in this story. The boy loved the FBI series about special agents, so when he saw the gun he didn't lose his head in the matter. He took the gun by the barrel so as not to smear his fingerprints and took it to his father, but the officer who arrived on call of course didn't care so much. He took the revolver by the handle without a second thought, examined it on the spot or in the glove compartment. The gun will lie in his desk drawer for a long time, while the investigators in the Tate and Lobyanka case will shrug their shoulders. Even more madness is like long murder. Tet and Laban were combined into one case. It took 3 months, as if every day in Hollywood there were such brutal murders, after which the criminals wrote on the walls in blood. Well, we will not talk about the fact that the police in those years were far behind in terms of technology. We are important. Other things. Many specialists then did not even imagine how to investigate such murders. All they were taught was how to use force. Nothing else was required of a cop. In 1964 President Lyndon Johnson started a war on crime. For this he sent strengthened police forces to poor black neighborhoods, but the result, as you understand, the exact opposite came out. After 10 years the crime index across the country increased threefold. Specifically in Los Angeles and the South Central area everything was even worse. Crime literally shrugged her shoulders, and blacks, and not only criminals and in principle, the majority of the population, simply hated the police for understanding. 60 what to 71 in America there were more than 700 riots on racial grounds. It turned out some kind of vicious circle. Johnson gave the police money and weapons so that they would contain the riots, but people protested because of this. Several times stronger police violence led to a general increase in violence in America. As a result, the cops were left with the armed forces less time and energy to investigate real crimes, and even more so to think about how not to smear the fingerprints of brutal killers. About a week after the murders, the police arrived at the Manson ranch. Left it was just by chance that a rumor reached the authorities that the hippies at Old Man Stan's were doing something wrong. And indeed, during the search the cops found his weapons, and M.J. Manson was arrested but very soon released due to an error in the documents. Well, what can you expect from them? It seems like it's not enough on the hippie side is playing around. Well, it's true that only Manson got worried after the raid. He moved the whole family to the already familiar to us Barker Ranch, which was safer in Death Valley. K.S. Watson decided to play it safe even more and went to his homeland in Texas. Several girls ran away. Shit in the middle of noon arranged for them to go and say tense atmosphere a few months later and to a new ranch. The cops came and hid in a cabinet under the sink, but it didn't help him. The whole sect was arrested on suspicion of hijacking a car and setting a forklift on fire. Shortly before that, Manson blew up a car because he didn't want construction to start near him. It was a sect and ruin it while Side is in there. Go get some shit. What was it? She killed Sharon Tate. Where she got such courage from is unclear, but apparently she's in jail for stealing cars. She wasn't having as much fun as she was for the mass murder of her cellmate Atkins. Left no doubt it was completely accidental and even boring. Manson's sect was caught simply because Stupa, out of fun or stupidity, reported on herself while sitting in the wilderness. Maybe no one would ever have found out who really killed Sharon Tate if the capture of this sect turned out to be completely boring. Then the trial of Charlie Manson became the loudest in American history. Manson enjoyed the attention too in his person and was generous with the press. He gave them everything they wanted. Charlie said that he was what the authorities themselves made of him, a typical product of the prison system. These words immediately appeared on the front pages. Manson carved a cross on his forehead. Allegedly this is how he crossed himself out of society. Well, or society crossed him out. The next day his photo and pictures of other family members with the same crosses looked at passers-by from all the newsstands. The dreams of an idiot came true. As a rock star, which Manson dreamed of becoming, he used every hearing in court as another concert, and performances there were many for almost a full-fledged tour, and the trial lasted 9 months. The verdict was delivered. The jury trial. This was a huge problem because it was necessary to gather people from who had no opinion on the Tate and LaBianca case. That is, the last 6 months these people had to almost sit in a bunker, not read the press, not watch TV, not listen to the radio, and not communicate with friends. And all of America discussed the details of the murder for months. Sharon Tate began the trial. Not a single American doubted that Manson and his sectarian girls were guilty. If so, the jury also believed it would be wrong from the point of view of blind justice. When the reclusive introverts were finally found and gathered, they were placed in a hotel and protected from any information about the trial, about where they lived. Even their relatives did not know them. They were driven to each hearing in tinted cars. And after the trial, they were also driven back in complete secrecy. Yes, they were the most protected people in the country. And then President Richard Nixon accused Manson in front of the whole country that he was guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders. This was a scandal. Nixon, of course, did not want to incline the court. He was simply outraged that there were so many sweet speeches about Manson at the instigation of the press. At the next hearing, Charlie raised a newspaper with the president's words in front of the jury. This destroyed their impartiality and, purely technically, the court, seriously, this still causes heated debates. Allegedly the trial became less fair because of this family, and Charlie caused the court a lot of problems. Manson attacked the judge with a pencil. Girls screamed and threatened witnesses, prosecutors, but there were things that were more terrible. Members of the cult who remained at large kidnapped lawyer Leslie Van Houten and dismembered him. The lawyer's body will be found only 5 months after his disappearance. In addition, the cultists threatened the prosecutor and planted a lethal dose of drugs in the witness's food. Another cultist even thought about hijacking a passenger plane to demand Manson's release and killing one passenger every hour until her demands were met. Fortunately, she was detained during an accidental robbery. However, let's get back to the trial. What took so long to sort out at all these hearings? There was a sincere confession that the problem was in something else. Manson was not directly at the scene of the crime, so it was very difficult to put him in jail. 1 hour 10 minutes and 3 seconds, he is like us. Remember, he himself did not kill anyone during these crimes, so the court had to prove that Charlie participated in the conspiracy, that is, he bore equal guilt for the crime. This is what the prosecution sought. The court was moved from a dead point by the testimony of Linda Kasabian. This is the girl who stood guard during the murders in the Lansky house. In order not to go to prison, she betrayed the family and became the main witness for the prosecution. She told in all the details what was the essence of Manson's teaching and how the family was preparing for the end of the world. Other sectarians, in response to these testimony, claimed that Manson was not involved in anything, but this did not help the jury. They deliberated for a long time, but in the end all the accused were sentenced to death, but in the end to life imprisonment, just like Ted Bundy. Manson became a hero of the media in prison. He gave several interviews. Some of them received prestigious awards until the very last day of his life. Charlie Manson received letters from admirers. Music, Susan Adkins, that same girl who stabbed Sharon Tate to death, she spent her entire life in prison, died of brain cancer in 2009. Patricia Crenn, Inc., participant in both murders, is in prison while we are recording this episode. She broke the record for the longest prison term in the United States for women. 54 years old Tex Watson became a priest and is still in prison. Bobby Beausoleil, who killed his friend for Manson and immediately repented, is also in prison since 69-year Manson himself died in prison in 2017. He lived to be 84 years old. The only participant in the crimes who left prison was Leslie Van Houten. She was released the year before last. After so many years, it is already quite obvious Charlie Manson, one of the most influential maniacs in history. Musician Marilyn Manson took his pseudonym in honor of Charlie. Popular ultra group Cabin, which has repeatedly come on tour to Russia, was named in honor of sectarian Linda Kasabian, accomplice of murderers. In 92nd year, Sharon Tate's house was bought by Trent Reznor, leader of the cult industrial group. On Nails, based on the mansion, he created a home studio which he called Leg, in honor of the inscription which was actually left in Sharon's blood on the door. And with Marilyn, he, by the way, also managed to work. Important to add that it was with Charles Manson that the trend for crime sensations began. Crimes became a mass spectacle. This will more than once inspire maniacs with a morbid desire for fame. For example, Zodiac will inspire to kill not only for pleasure but also for public attention. But not only that is why Manson still remains the most famous maniac of the United States of America. It is believed that his crime put an end to the turbulent 60s, locked the golden age of Hollywood with a key, and forever compromised. Not just like that, Quentin Tarantino decided to give his film Once Upon a Time in America an alternative ending, although no less bloody but much more positive. Many are sure that if not for those murders, the cultural revolution in the States would not have choked. So they emphasize that Manson, in fact, he turned out to be a powerful and fatal figure and was really able to turn the fate of an entire country around. Is this an exaggeration? Of course, but where would such dramatic stories be without him? Dear friends, thank you for watching our episodes.